Hi, my name is Shaini Goodwin. That's my personal name. Most of you know me as Dove of Oneness on the internet. I do the NESARA reports on the internet at www.nesara.us, and that, for those of you who haven't read them, is www. N as in Nancy, E as in elephant, S as in Sam, A-R-A, .u as in United, S as in States. Okay? So I have been looking into NESARA for almost 6 years. I've been on the internet doing the Dove reports for 6 years next month. My reason for doing this is because something has to be done to help the world and to help America. America is off course. When I heard about NESARA, it was in June 2000. NESARA was my third and is my third humanitarian project. My first one was when I was working at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. I was a data systems, computer systems manager. I belonged to the state associations, agencies, associations of data processing and information processing. I started my career in information processing over 30 years, well, around 30 years ago. And I have done numbers of things in the computer and information systems environment. I spent 2 tours at manufacturing headquarters of software and hardware systems. Both tours, I was assigned in Minneapolis. The first was where the corporate headquarters was. The second was in the early 1980s when I worked for Sperry Univac, and I was the corporate liaison to the Midwest of the northern Midwest area, and I worked with beta systems sites as well as belonging to the think tank that came out with the SperryLink Office Information System, which at that time was a very leading edge system, ran on mainframes. So I have worked in the mainframe environment. It also ran on distributed micros, so I've worked in the micro environment, and of course on the desk station level, which is minis are the distributed and the micros are the desk station, or what we call PCs today. It happens that the SperryLink system was very advanced for its time. In 1983, we were doing email. We were doing scheduling meetings on a calendar that everyone's calendar was checked, and then we could schedule a meeting. We were doing calendars. We were doing integrating data processing files, spreadsheet files, word processing files, everything together. What you see in Microsoft Office products, it was inspired by the SperryLink system. And I'm happy it was, because Sperry was a great technology company, but not good in marketing. So you can have great technology, but if you can't get it out there, it doesn't last. And Bill Gates saw the SperryLink system, and his people saw it, and they said, this is great. This is where we want to go. So today, what he has on his system is what we had in '83. And I'm pleased that I was a part of that, because I think it makes our lives easier, all this computer technology. But after that tour in computers, I began to feel personally like I wasn't doing enough for the world. The world was getting into more and more difficulties, more and more problems. People's lives weren't improving. They were disintegrating in various ways. And so I kept having this yearning to do something beneficial for the planet, for the people, for the environment, everything. And finally, in June 2000, I learned about NESARA. Now, I had, when I was working for the Evergreen State College, I had done my first political activist project, and that was that the legislature was considering a bill to put all computers in state agencies under one agency, new agency, no matter where the computers were. Well, we had computers in all different places, and PCs were just coming in. We had mainframes all over the place. We had mini systems all over the place. But they wanted to put everything into one agency, and then that agency would allow very free access to citizens' information without thinking about privacy to all the state agencies. That's an extreme abuse of your information. So I was at that time the vice president of the state agency's Information Technology Association, and I fought that. And I built a coalition of people, and we lobbied the legislature, and when we weren't able to get them to stop that bill, because it was very poorly written, I went to the ex-governor, Dan Evans, and he went in and stopped it because it was very poorly funded. Its financial basis was poor. So we stopped that. Some years later, they came back with a much better idea, and that's what they have today. That was my first activist project. My second one was when the FDA was wanting to take over the control of vitamins and minerals and food supplements. And many of you fought that battle with us. And at the very end, when we only had 2 weeks left to get the bill passed in Congress in '94 that would stop the FDA from taking over these things and taking them off the shelves, basically, then I realized I had to find out who was stopping it. There was a representative to Congress from Beverly Hills who was the second largest receiver of PAC money from the pharmaceutical industry. And he sat on the committee in the House of Representatives that was sitting on the bill and wasn't letting it go to vote. And I mean, millions of people were contacting Congress and saying, we don't want the FDA over our vitamins and food supplements. And yet that man sat there at the head of the committee and wouldn't let that bill come on the agenda to be voted out of committee. So I realized we had to do something, and I organized some people in the Seattle Olympia area to go with me, to prepare to go with me to the FDA headquarters in North Seattle and do a protest. And I called ABC, NBC, and CBS stations in Seattle, and I said, are you interested in this? And two of the three said yes. And so they said, just tell us when you're going to be there and we'll show up. We'd love to cover it, but nobody's doing anything that lets us make a coverage of it. So I said, well, we're going to be there and we're going to talk about this unless they get this voted out of this committee and get it to the House floor so it can be voted on and passed. Because there were only, that was at that time, about 10 days left or 7 days left of voting time. And I found out who was sitting on it, where it was sitting. And I called his office and I said, look, you're stopping millions of Americans from having their voice heard and from letting their people vote this, that we do not want the FDA controlling our vitamins and food supplements. And the secretary said, well, he has the right to do that. And I said, well, let me explain that we are going to do a demonstration in front of the FDA building in Seattle in so many days. It was about 5 days at that time. And we have coverage of NBC and ABC, and we're going to do it early in the morning so it can go to the 6 o'clock news on the East Coast and be out there. And we're going to tell the people of this country, one man is standing in the way and is going to put their vitamins and food supplements under the FDA, which means taken off the shelves, essentially. And so when she heard that, she passed it on. And I said, I'm giving you 2 days. And in 2 days, he had that voted out of committee, and it was into the House. It passed the House to stop the FDA, passed the House 5 hours before they adjourned for the year. That tells you the kind of determination I have. When I did my first project with the computers and the agency, I was up against the governor of Washington, the sitting governor of Washington. I was a state employee, and it didn't let me stop. It did not stop me, and I will not stop. We will get NESARA announced, and you are helping. You helped with the FDA thing, and you're helping now. So we're going to talk about what it requires. There is a real urgency here, and that's why I pulled together this meeting so quickly. Monday, I knew I wasn't going to be going across the water, so I put out the invitation, and here you are, and thank you so much. I really appreciate your being here. This is probably one of the most important meetings we're ever going to do, and probably one of the most important ways for you to help is what we'll talk about later. To get this NESARA law announced, and it has to be a little fixed first. There's some problems that were purposely put in by the people controlling it. And you're going to see in the farm claims videos that we're going to play today that this was happening in terms of trying to get the country back on course a long time. They talk about a 20-year process. They talk about an investigation starting in 1983. So we also have an audio tape that talks about these things. People have said, well, I wasn't involved, neither was I. But what I've done is a lot of research. And for the first 4 years of writing the Dove reports on NESARA.us is where they are now, and I had a couple other websites before that. I never really thought I was going to be doing this long term, you know. I thought it would get done and we'd all go on with our lives. But at 4 years, when I learned about NESARA in June 2000, I was like, wow, here it is. Here is what I've been looking for to help the world, because I know I am here to do something to help the world, something of substance. So I said, wow, we've got to do this. We've got to support this. And so I started writing about NESARA. NESARA is practically all of the Dove reports from then on. And it's the most important thing on the planet today, and you'll see why. We'll talk about why. And many of you know why. There were other things that I wrote about, and including the prosperity programs. For a long time, we were told they were linked. And my information came from a Secret Service agent on the President's detail, who I call a white knight, and some people call him the King of Swords. I call him KOS, just use the initials. He was the first person to leak it into my network, and he received his information from Naval Intelligence. He was also briefed. At that time, in June 2000, he was on the President's detail as a Secret Service agent protecting the President. And he was briefed that when NESARA was announced, he would have to escort the occupant of the Oval Office out of that office, because at that point we're having a temporary government using our constitutional law line of succession until we can have new elections. So he was briefed officially on that piece of NESARA. He was given some broad outlines of other information as well. I also had information come in from people who had other contacts in DC, 2 senators had, in October of 2001, said yes, that 99% of what Dove is saying in her reports is right on target, accurate, that there is supposed to be a government change. NESARA is there. They did vote on it. It is a law, but it's under gag order. And you're going to find out today that gag order has been a consistent strategy used by the opposition to keep this whole reformation of our country from happening. So we are going to all learn together what's been going on for 20 years and onward, and what's been happening now. I supported NESARA with everything I had, and I accepted the information from our telephone network, and some people sent me emails occasionally telling me what was going on with NESARA in the first 4 years, from June 2000 to June 2004. And I checked with another white knight source through an intermediary who is a well-known business person in London, who also had connections with intelligence people and military people in the US, and he as well knew about NESARA. And then we had confirmations starting to come in, and I've brought a copy of my printouts from my computer of my confirmations that show the people's names and email addresses. We have confirmations on the website, on NESARA.us. But we don't put their names, we don't put their email addresses, and we don't put their phone numbers, because people will be harassed. I know it because I get harassed all the time through email. And that's why I don't put my personal name on the website. There are a lot of crazies out there, if you will, and if they don't like what you're saying, they're more likely to be angry and shoot off a vituperative email at you, and it's not very much fun. In fact, it's very unpleasant to open those up and have someone swearing at you and calling you names and that sort of thing. And so I would not subject the people who went to the trouble and had the courage to confirm NESARA for themselves. I'm not going to subject them to that, but I will. We do have a copy you can look at today during the breaks of these confirmations, so you can see they're real. And I brought my little laptop. This one has been serving me since June of 2002, and it has a file for confirmations here. And if you want to look at those, I'll show you those. So I'm being as above board and bringing you as much information as I possibly can, because we have some work to do together to turn this country around, and it's very doable. And you need to know that there's a lot of foundation here to do this, and we have the absolute right to do it, and we need to do it. How many people here have confirmed NESARA for yourself? Anybody? All right, great. Would you, each of you would you stand up and talk about, well, just say out loud. Let's start up front. Bonnie, did you confirm NESARA? Okay, just tell us a little bit about your confirmation.
Well, I've gone to my local bank in Visalia and talked with the tellers there.
And the name of the bank?
Bank of Visalia, and
Okay.
it is presently called Valley Business Bank. It's a very small bank. There's only 5 branches, and I've talked with them about NESARA in the past. Most of the tellers won't acknowledge anything, but the business teller, that is one of the head tellers there, has given me the wink and, you know, the knowing glance when I said, "Do you have the new Treasury notes in your vault as yet? And are you trained?" And she said, "Well, yes, we're trained," and that's about it.
Excellent. Okay, I think Bonnie's next.
Mine is from Tammy. All her enthusiasm has gotten me excited about doing something for the world and peace and so forth. So I did a lot of reading and investigating on your reports and all the website and everything for, what, a year and a half now. And going with the marches, peace marches with Tammy, and meeting all these other lovely people. And it is so exciting. And some people that I have met, one a Navy SEAL, that goes back and forth to Washington, D.C., has heard about NESARA and some other things, and he's doing some more investigation, and he's going to get back to me the first of the week. And he travels all over the world, so he's going to let me know, you know, how much else he can help. So.
Next person, the gentleman in the light blue shirt you mentioned you had behind you.
Actually quite a few, but the one I can talk about, in the post office in Los Feliz, went in one day to buy stamps and that sort of thing, talking to the clerk, and she had no idea, in the post office, Los Feliz, had no idea what I was talking about, and asked her supervisor who was walking by, and she said, "You know what this man is talking about?" And he looked at me and said, "Are you speaking of NESARA?" And I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "I've been hearing about that now for 3 years." Confirmed.
Well, did you have a banking confirmed even without mentioning? You said you had others you couldn't talk about.
Well, yeah, some I won't talk about, but the banks, I have gone to my local Bank of America, Wells Fargo, et cetera, in that same area, and ask about the currency, the new money, the Treasury, and they said yes. And some will just give you a nod, some will actually come out and talk about it, and others will give you a wink, but it's been confirmed to me many, many times.
Thank you. Next person? I saw some more hands. Behind Melissa, I guess.
Hello. Yes, about 2 years ago, I went into, is it loud enough? About 2 years ago, I went into a Wells Fargo bank in Toluca Lake, in California. And I walked up to the teller and I asked her when the new rainbow currency would be issued. She wasn't too aware of what I was speaking of. She thought she should go talk to a supervisor. So she went to the rear of the bank, and she took up with the supervisor or the manager, and she discussed with her at length for probably about 3 minutes, and I watched them going back and forth in very excited, animated conversation. She came back to the window and she said, "It won't be too long from now. Yes, we do have it in the bank, but it'll be about a couple of months before we actually issue the rainbow currency." So to me, that was a good confirmation.
And that was what month and year?
This was last year in the spring, about April.
So 2004, April.
Yes.
Okay, great. Anybody else? We aren't taking your picture. Lady behind you.
My first one was when Dove suggested that we contact the US Secretary of the Treasury, O'Neill, which I did, and he responded, and he called it something else, but he used NESARA, and he said it hadn't been voted into law. You know, he told, but he did say
The
that
cover
there was
story.
such a thing. So it was, you know, somewhat. But on several occasions, my husband and I had talked to tellers at B of A, and I've talked to a teller up in Seattle, and then in the Riverside area, and then my credit union. Also, I've had them tell me, yes, that they've been trained, and the last one was this spring, and it was at B of A, and she said that she'd been trained in part one of the new banking system, the new treasury system, but she hadn't received all of it because she was a new employee.
Great. Anybody else? Okay, that's good. We are going to play a couple of NESARA confirmations as soon as our audio engineer gets up here to push the, she didn't know I was going to do that. I didn't have time to put a script together, so we're all winging in this today. We're all in this together. It's brand new. Play the confirmations. Hi, Ethel. This is Dove. How are you?
I'm fine, darling. How are you?
Good, good. You know, I wanted to ask you about that confirmation you had from someone who has, her husband works for the UN, I believe, or works with the UN.
That's correct.
Yeah. When did you actually talk with that lady?
I believe it was April of 2004.
Okay. And where were you when you met with her?
This was in Virginia. I went back to my boarding school's reunion, and she was not in my class. She was a good bit younger, a good 10, maybe even 15 years younger. But we spoke. Everyone there was very friendly because everyone has breakfast together on Sunday. I don't know how it came up. We were asking what people's husbands did or something along that line, and she said that her husband was with the UN. So, of course, trying to seem a little bit intelligent, I said, well, do you know Kofi Annan? She said, oh, very well. He's a very close friend. Well, I was very impressed, and I took it one step further, and I said, well, won't it be wonderful when NESARA is announced? She said, oh, absolutely. It'll be just wonderful. She didn't bat an eye. She didn't hesitate. She just came right out with it.
Great. That is really super. Well, I appreciate you telling me about that because I want to share this with some of the folks that are going to be at our meeting and just let them hear in people's own words about their confirmation. So this is going to be great. I really appreciate it. Hi, Sharona. This is Dove. How are you tonight?
Hi, Dove. Just fine, thank you.
Good. You know, you told us a really great example of a different kind of confirmation of NESARA when you met with us there in North Carolina. And I thought it would be really interesting to hear a little bit more about that. When was that you were having this meeting, and where was it?
It took place in Congress in September of 2003 in the office of a prominent congressman.
Okay. And then just kind of give your own story as to what happened.
Well, I was visiting this particular congressman with a well-known author and a number of others. And in the course of our conversation, I dropped the name of NESARA. And to my utter surprise, he jumped right out of his seat upon hearing the word and ran to the door of his office. And as I saw this was occurring, I quickly changed the subject, and he literally pivoted around slowly and returned to his chair and acted as if nothing had happened and just simply resumed the conversation from before.
Wow. Did you happen to notice his expression or anything when he jumped up?
Well, it was very quick. I would say it was one of great caution and some concern, but understated. To behavior was, how can I explain it? It was just extraordinary.
Yeah, that really would be. For someone to jump up with no warning and rush for the door. It's amazing.
He did not know me well at the time. He knows me better now. I guess he didn't know who I was. I was someone to be cautious about. He did, I guess, what was helpful at the time. But to me, I thought that was a strong confirmation that NESARA is so.
Right, and obviously under gag order. He gave a very physical reaction and proof of that.
Very strong reaction. It was very indicative that there was something going on around NESARA.
Right. Well, I really appreciate you sharing that, because that's a real physical confirmation that we haven't really had one like that before, so I thought it would be very interesting to have that. Thank you so much. Hi, Dan. This is Dove. How are you?
Hey, Dove. I'm doing good. How are you?
Good, good. We're going to have an interesting meeting this weekend in Los Angeles, and I understand that you recently had a very interesting NESARA confirmation. Would you, just without too much detail to protect those under gag order, but would you mind sharing that with us?
Sure, I don't mind a bit. It was literally about 3 weeks ago. It was just before my trip to Europe. I was at an event where a certain very well-known congressman was speaking in front of a group. There was probably 100 plus attendees, and while he was on stage, I was off on the side and had been conversing with him before he went on stage, as well as with his scheduling assistant. And so while he was up there, I was talking with her, and I had asked, while he was up there talking, I said, hey, are you under any gag order that would prevent you from talking about the National Economic Security and Reformation Act? And she right away had a little smile on her face and said no. And I said, so, you know about it? She goes, yes. And I said, so are we ever going to get that thing announced? And her comment was, not with this administration in office. And so I said, oh, so we need to make a few arrests, huh? And she smiled even bigger. She goes, we absolutely do. So I took that as, to me, there was no better confirmation than I could get, because this is somebody who, earlier she had explained to me she'd been in this business for over 15 years as a scheduler in the public relations side of Congress. That she'd actually been doing that for over 15 years. So this person really is close to the heart of what is going on up in Congress. So for me, that was about the best confirmation I know of.
That sounds really good, yes. And I certainly, those who are directly under the gag order, the people in Congress, couldn't do this kind of a call with us, but that is an excellent confirmation, and I really appreciate you sharing that. Thanks so much.
Oh, you're welcome. I knew she was under that, the other person speaking was under gag order, so would not be able to comment. But when you can get somebody who's, right next to one of those individuals who can, then to me that was about as close as it gets.
Absolutely. Well, I'm sure a lot of people will enjoy hearing this. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
This is Doug. How are you?
Hey, Dove. I'm doing great today. How are you?
Great, great. Thanks so much for talking with me this morning. Some time ago, you sent in a very interesting confirmation of NESARA, where you had spoken with a lady who had gone through NESARA training in a bank.
That's right.
When was that?
That was a little over 2 years ago. I believe it was around April of 2003.
Okay. And can you tell us which bank it was?
It was a Compass Bank in Dallas, Texas.
Okay. And would you just tell us what she told you, what you asked her and what she told you and so on?
Well, basically, I was just making a deposit there in the bank, excuse me, and I just asked her if she's had the training that it's required for the tellers and the banking personnel because of the NESARA law that's coming in, and she basically just, her eyes just opened up really wide, and she said, oh, yes. As a matter of fact, we had 1 week where we had to go to classes. Every day had to be there, I believe she said at 8:30, and we left at 5. We couldn't miss any days. Basically, she said it was like taking banking all over again. And she said that at the end of the week, they had an exam, and you had to make at least a 90 on that exam. If you didn't, you'd have to take the course all over again. So I was just amazed.
Wow.
I just couldn't believe what I was hearing, and I had my mind like it was on record. I have to remember all of this, and I remember it pretty well here.
Yes.
And, because it was so amazing. And I said, well, thanks a lot. I hope they announce NESARA soon. And she just looked at me and smiled, and I knew that you couldn't tell me anything about NESARA because they're all under gag order. And so I said, I'll see you later. Bye-bye. And so that was it. It was just an amazing confirmation.
Yeah, it really was. Well, it's so, you know, bankers don't send tellers to school unless they absolutely have to and hire substitutes for a whole week to do their work. That's very unusual. So obviously, they have a very good course, it sounds like, in doing the training. Very thorough.
Yeah, it really does. Like she said, it was just like taking banking all over again. So she learned something all new.
Wow. Wow, that's something, isn't it?
It's really amazing.
Well, I really appreciate your time, and thank you so much for having the courage to ask, because a lot of people don't ask when they could, and find out for themselves that NESARA is real, and banks have done training, not all banks, but some, and that's great. I really appreciate your confirmation information. That's super.
And I did get another confirmation from another bank in Dallas, a Northern Trust Bank, and I asked the teller, we had to go inside, they all have desks inside, and I said, have you had the training from NESARA? And she just said, yeah, I know all about it. But she didn't tell me too much or anything, but she definitely confirmed that she knew all about it.
Wow, that's something.
Yeah, it was fun. It was just great.
That's super. Well, thank you so much, JD. I really appreciate you telling us about this, and I'm sure a lot of people will feel really great hearing about what you've been able to confirm.
They should feel great because this is really happening. I know it in my bones.
It's happening, absolutely. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dove. Glad to help out.
Okay. That's for everybody who's had the courage to ask, because it isn't easy sometimes, and you think, oh, they're going to think I'm crazy. You know, what kind of a nut are you or something, because it's not out in the papers, the newspapers, the television stations, radio, but it really is happening. And there's been a lot going on the last 20 years especially that's been very secret. You may or may not know, depending on how hooked in you are to alternative news, that Reagan, during his time, was printing the rainbow treasury currency. I see someone nodding her head. And he was actually buying gold offshore and bringing it to the U.S. in an attempt to get us back to a treasury bank system and get our money backed by gold again. Obviously, he wasn't successful. They were successful to the point that some of that rainbow currency was shipped out to the banks and is out there still in some of these bank vaults. So some of you mentioned that in your confirmations. The email confirmations I received talk about the rainbow currency quite a bit. It's not this stuff that's the Federal Reserve. It's a US Treasury currency bill, and they're different colors. In Canada and in Europe, they have, for every denomination of bill, a $1, $5, $10, $20, and so on. or pounds or euro, they have different colors. In Canada has that, and we're going to have that. So when the US Treasury currency comes out, it will look very different from Federal Reserve. And Reagan did make this effort, but the opposition has squashed it. So some of the currency is in the banks are still holding it, but it's been held back. And that's what the rainbow currency, that's why they talk about that sometimes. So there was an effort in the 80s. Now this investigation that we're going to hear about from the farm claims videos, and I have one audio tape that I hope we can hear pretty well. It has some background noise, but hang on a second. These really do help us to understand the history of what's been going on in the U.S. and that people have been working very hard to get us back to constitutional law and a U.S. Treasury bank system. Yes?
I heard that there was a new $10 bill that the government is going to get.
Yeah, it's just the Federal Reserve stuff. Anything you hear now.
Muddy up the NESARA?
No, not at all. Doesn't have anything to do with NESARA. It's a separate agenda. You have to realize there are agendas of the current government going forward, and there's NESARA. It's a completely separate issue. They're not connected at all. Yeah, back there. The rainbow currency? The silver certificates, yes. Yes, it is. John F. Kennedy was another president who tried to get us back to a U.S. Treasury bank system. When he went into the president's office, he found out there was an awful lot of trouble, and the country may have known some of this beforehand. But he did get out billions of dollars of U.S. Treasury silver certificates, and his plan was to actually replace all the Federal Reserve currency and just kind of quietly dissolve the Federal Reserve and get it out of our banking system. That is a very important thing, because we are not, as a nation, we are not as healthy and wealthy as we should be because of what the Federal Reserve does to us economically and to the world. Yes?
What I'd like to know, because since the President Clinton signed this into law in 2000, am I right?
Go ahead.
Since President Clinton he's the last president to really sign this into law, am I correct?
Yes?
Well, my question is what kind of a gag order overrides a presidential order?
The U.S. Supreme Court. We have 3 different pieces of government. We have legislative, executive, and judicial. And we're going to see here that the U.S. Supreme Court has been in, let's leave it there, has been in control of this for over 20 years. And the U.S. Supreme Court were the ones who decided the farmers' cases. If you've read the history on NESARA.us, if you've read the history,
yes,
it talks about how the farmers' lands were being foreclosed on. They became suspicious that there wasn't something was wrong here. How come so many of us are being foreclosed on? And they took it into court. They did some research. They found out fraud was involved. The Federal Reserve System is practicing fraudulent loan practices, and they took that into court, and they found out then going to the government that the government was in complicity with this, and that the banks were in complicity with this, and so they started doing lawsuits. And finally, some of them ended up in the U.S. Supreme Court.
But you have to say that what we're talking about right now, this is all treasonous acts.
Of course, there's lots of treason by our government. We're going to be covering a lot of that today.
Well, amen.
Okay? Yeah, absolutely. They're not doing the right thing. No way. So what happened was the farmers took these cases to the U.S. Supreme Court, and in the meantime, they engaged the support of many of our top military officers, and both retired and active. And they said, look what's happening to us. Look what's happening to the country. This Federal Reserve System is practicing fraud. We are being bled dry with, you know what 70% of the national debt is? It's fees and interest owed to the Federal Reserve. And earlier in the 90s, it was 80%. And the reason for that is that the Federal Reserve Act was passed in 1913 in a very tricky way, and it was done after people, the so-called elite bankers and people in high finance had gotten together at Jekyll Island and put together this idea of getting a central bank that was privately owned passed as our bank for the US. And so the farmers did all their research, and they had their ducks in a row. And they went to our military officers and they said, look what's happening to this country. And our military did their own investigation, and they said, you're right. So they sat in that US Supreme Court hearing in those sessions. The military sat, those top officers, in those sessions, and they privately told the judges, we know what the law is, we know what's constitutional, we know we haven't been under constitutional law since 1933 when FDR took us out, through the National Banking Emergency Act, which he had no real reason to do. That was another treasonous thing, and it was the bank, the Federal Reserve, telling him there'd been a run on gold. Guess what? There wasn't. It was not a big run on gold. And that was a lie. And they all were in it together. So he put us into a national emergency, and we haven't been out of it since. All the presidents, except Kennedy, used that to their advantage to gain more power, because when we're under emergency, they use the War Powers Act and things to gain more power for themselves, to do things they shouldn't be doing under the Constitution, which is why most of them didn't want to get rid of it. But Kennedy was working his way back to that. And they found that out, and the Federal Reserve ordered the hit, the CIA planned it, and we had military snipers that took him out. Yes?
Why did General Dick Myers resign from the Joint Chief, and is the current chairman, General Peter Pace, pro-NESARA?
No, none of the Joint Chiefs are pro-NESARA, and as to why he did it, I don't know. I mean, they change offices once in a while, and I'm not concerned about that. It's not for us. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to have some of the farm claims videos played now, and we'll start with one that kind of reviews what had happened in our country since 1913. And by the way, these were done by amateurs. Yes, the gentleman in the gray suit. Not yet. Let me finish. We're going to play this one all the way through, and this gentleman is going to talk about some history that you may or may not know. And this was filmed on site. What's the date, Tammy? 10/15/93. And I believe it was in Colorado, because he talks to the people about Colorado. But what has happened, of course, is people went to the meeting, someone taped it, then they sent copies out, people made copies, other people made copies. I probably have fourth generation copy here. But they don't, on the front of these so far, no one has introduced themselves. Apparently they miss that piece of it when they're duping him. So I know his first name is Norman. I can't tell you the rest of it. I haven't been able to research my network in time to get that. So he's going to do a nice overview, and you're going to hear about what was going on in the 80s and 90s with people doing investigation of the banking system. And that is the foundation that eventually ended up being NESARA. Okay, go ahead.
In early April of this year, Joe at that time was writing claims in eastern Kansas. My wife and I met him at that time. We filed a claim in late April. I had studied this program since August of 1992, studied constitutional books, learned from the tapes what this program was about, and Roy Swassinger put lots of question marks in my mind. Consequently, I studied throughout the winter, reading several constitutional books, learned that what Roy Swassinger was stating at his meetings throughout the mid-states. He had meetings in Enid, Oklahoma, Salina, Kansas, Manhattan, Kansas, Topeka, and up into Nebraska. Yes, Steve?
I'm sorry to interrupt. We can't get a mic. Joe said he would, if he wanted him to, he'd take over.
Well, I'll speak for a while, and when I give out,
And when
I'll
your
turn
voice
it over.
gives out, we'll let Joe
Okay.
take over.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
But it was through videotapes of Roy Swassinger's meetings that I learned about this. A good friend of mine had gone to these meetings, in Enid, Oklahoma, Salina, Kansas. And that's the way I became aware of what was happening. I'm going to start by going clear back to 1913. This is when the Federal Reserve was initiated. It was put together in the middle of the night, 2 days before Christmas, by a man named Hunter, who was the right-hand man of Woodrow Wilson. Unbeknownst to Mr. Wilson and the president, he had formulated a plan with many of the very wealthy families in the world. He called them together 2 days before Christmas, and they worked out the plan to initiate the Federal Reserve System, ultimately controlling the financial status in this country and later throughout the world. This happened in 1913. Mr. Wilson learned of what had transpired. Congress passed that the next day after their meeting in the middle of the night, Mr. Hunter's meeting, and it was passed the next day in Congress. Charles Lindbergh's father was then a senator. He tried to get it stopped on the floor of Congress, and he was unable to do so. When Congress re-adjourned after Christmas, Mr. Lindbergh again tried to get the Federal Reserve Act withdrawn. Still unable to do so, because the powers of the rich had filled the pockets of many of the congressmen, thus getting it made law. Later on, they established the 8 Federal Reserve banks, still owned by the wealthy families of the world, or the nation here and the world. It was in 1916 that the War Powers was passed. Before that, they passed the federal income tax to fill the coffers of the Federal Reserve. Federal income tax is the 16th Amendment. Passed unlawfully. To become amendment, it needed to be ratified by 36 states, because we had 48 states at that time, and 2/3 of the states had to ratify it. We learned that only 2 possibly ratified the 16th Amendment. We have now doubt that more than one actually ratified the 16th Amendment, making it law. It was back when our Constitution was put together, our forefathers stated that there would be no tax levied on the citizens of the United States for their labors. And this is exactly what federal income tax is. The only legal tax in this country is an excise tax. That's a tax on the items you purchase. However, they got this put through, being unlawful and unconstitutionally passed. In 1933, when FDR was president, he drew the gold from behind our currency. Up until that time, our currency was backed by gold and silver. In 1932, the Federal Reserve bought our gold for $1 billion. The 9 wealthy families that controlled the Federal Reserve actually bought the gold that backed our dollar. At that time, they said that any time the Treasury or the United States wanted to buy that gold back, they could do it for $1.4 billion. Also in 1932, Mr. Roosevelt enacted the War Powers Act, which came about in 1916. The War Powers Act was passed to give the president the power, in case of emergency, to conduct business, if you will, and make rules over the heads of Congress. Congress did not have to pass on these things due to the War Powers Act. It was also in the War Powers Act that the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the military would be allowed, if this country ever became in distress financially, or if the country was in a extreme case of an emergency. The Joint Chiefs of Staff could step in and get the government straightened out and see that the government was operating like the Constitution states. In 1963, we wound up with a liberal Supreme Court. It was that year that they passed the rule that it was unlawful to say prayer in church. Throughout the years, they had just gradually imposed their powers upon the family structure, which this country was built on. 1967, they started to move to take the silver from behind the dollar. Silver was still backing the dollar, but at a very high inflated rate. In 1968, they succeeded in taking the silver from behind their dollar. The only thing that has backed the Federal Reserve note since 1968 has been a printing press run by the Federal Reserve, which is owned by the wealthy families of the world. In 1972, we had already had what was called the Council of Foreign Relations, and their move was to get the country down to a more socialistic type government. And they were not doing this fast enough for the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, and the wealthy families that owned the Federal Reserve. So in 1972, they initiated Trilateral Commission. This brought more wealthy families into the nucleus of the Federal Reserve. At that time, 300 more families joined that nucleus. In 1976, they did the ultimate with your tax dollars that you were sending in. Up until 1976, when you sent your income tax in, it was endorsed on the back, paid to the Treasury of the United States. After 1976, the endorsement said pay to any Federal Reserve bank. Since 1976, all income tax filtered right through the Federal Reserve System, out of this country to Europe, where it was put in the banks owned by the Federal Reserve owners. There it drew interest at the rate of 25% and 30% paid monthly. So over the last 60 years, close to it at that time, the money pile was huge that the Federal Reserve owners held in foreign banks. Also, in 1982, they enacted the new Constitution of the District of Columbia. When they did this, there was 2 representatives from each state had to vote on that. Initially, it was put together to keep the power from the people here up in government, like our Constitution stated. But when they got that bill to Washington, they turned it 180 degrees, and since 1982, we've been operating under the Constitution of the District of Columbia. The power was coming down instead of up from the people. 1991, this country was actually operating on 22% of the currency that had ever been printed. 78% of our currency is out of country, held by foreigners. no country can operate properly with only 22% of its currency. That brings us up to the fall of 1992, or the summer of 1992. It was discovered in the summer months of 1992 by airline pilots. There were 5 huge camps built in this country. They went up very fast. This brought concern to these pilots. They reported it. And when enough had reported it, they had the military go check on it. These camps, by the time they got there to check, were already holding UN troops. Brought into this country, unbeknownst to even the military people. When this was learned, the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the military immediately ordered that those troops be removed from this country and taken back to their homelands. These troops were brought here for a purpose. George Bush, had he been elected president, had already planned to initiate the New World Order, or the New States of America. 2 years ago, I saw a map of this New World Order, what it would do to the United States of America. The line started at the polar cap and they ran clear through the North American continent. There were 5 regions. Had George Bush been elected president, you would not be living in Colorado today. You'd be in Region 3 of the New World Order. This was supposed to go into play had George Bush been elected president on December the 19th. He was going to call a bank holiday. He knew that the populace would not be happy and probably have chaos. And that's the reason the UN troops were brought in. Also, when this was to play, our military were to be sent to other countries to do the same thing, to initiate the New World Order. They knew that our military would not arrest dissidents in this country, so they brought in the UN troops to do this. These 5 huge camps were to put people who did not conform to the new rules. One camp in Alaska would hold 2 million people. There was one in Nevada, one in Oklahoma, and 2 in the Northeast states. So this is what was coming to play. In August of 1992, we were that close to becoming another country of Russia. And we still haven't gotten away from it, folks. It was in August that the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the military stepped in. They ordered 35 ex-high-ranking military men who were known pro-constitutionalists to meet in Omaha, Nebraska, and determine a method to get this country operating back like the true Constitution states. They met in August in Omaha. Then the Joint Chiefs of Staff called back to active service 300 such people, all ex-military men of high rank and all pro-constitutionalists. Of these 300, 35 were already involved and made up part of the 300. These 35 people that met in Omaha, Nebraska, there were 17 very, very high-ranking ex-military men. They hold a rank in the military higher than Colin Powell. Over the life of our nation, there's been 23 such persons in the military. Today, there are 17. Royce Wassinger is one of those persons. And I know another man who is one of those persons. His name is Jim Patterson. They were 2 that were in Omaha, and they also were in the 300. When these 300 people got together, they were instructed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff to come up with the plan to get this country running properly again. They broke off in groups of 15 and 20, told to work on this plan. Then they came back together, a nucleus of 300, and determined which plan they would use. It was at the Joint Chiefs of Staff's power to initiate martial law back in August of 1992 when these UN troops were found. They did not wish to do this. They wanted to get the government straightened up by other methods. And when I say government, I'm talking about the financial institutions, I'm talking about the political arena as a whole. There's many things that had been found done fraudulently throughout the years by both entities. It was in November that these 300 ex-military men, all pro-constitutionalists, hand-picked a group of, or a company of military men known as the Delta Force. We've had a Delta Force in this country for several years. They are very highly trained, intelligent persons in the Secret Service part of the military, and they were all handpicked to do a job. That job was go to Europe and go to the countries where the Federal Reserve had held the dollars that had been raped from the populace of this country for some 80 years. This money was brought back in November in the form of gold and silver. It's a tremendous amount of money. It was at this time that the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the military asked the 3 candidates running for president to come forward, meet with them, and at that time the Joint Chiefs of Staff laid a document on the table and asked if they would sign it. When they read that document, it stated that they would in fact help to get this country running back like the true Constitution states. And all 3 candidates signed that document in the early fall of 1992. It was after that document was signed that George Bush never again ever spoke of the New World Order. All the campaign speeches that he had made up until that time, he would always mention the New World Order. He never again mentioned it. And he would close his campaign speeches by saying, "God bless America," or "God bless the United States of America." The first president making a campaign speech in 60 years who closed his speeches with that statement. After the Joint Chiefs of Staff had these gentlemen sign this document, they asked that the Federal Reserve people come forward, and they bought back the Federal Reserve, the gold, if you will, that the Federal Reserve had had for some 80 years, and they paid $1.4 billion for it. The exact figure that was agreed upon back in 1913, or 1933, excuse me. On November the 30th of 1992, our national debt was paid in full. We have no national debt. Early November, Royce Wassinger wanted to go on the news media and tell the people of this country about the fraud that has been perpetrated upon them. The Supreme Court put a gag order on Mr. Wassinger, stating that should he do this, it would be probably worse than the 1929 market crash, stock market crash. People would probably make runs on banks, shoot one another, whatever. to get monies that they had in banks. So there was a gag order imposed on him by the court. At that time, Mr. Schwasinger laid documents on the bench of the Supreme Court and said, if I have to operate under a gag order, I think you should look at these instruments and perhaps put the news media on a gag order. After studying what Mr. Schwasinger had, and they were in fact instruments that proved that the news media had been operating illegally, had never registered to do business like they were supposed to, didn't have an ID number in the states where they had their newscasts and newspapers. And so the Supreme Court, in fact, put a gag order on the news media. That's the reason you have not learned of this through the newspapers, television, because we have had to operate under a gag order since November of 1992. They allowed Mr. Schwasinger to hold grassroots meetings, videotape those meetings, and distribute those videotapes. In other words, the only way he could get his message out was by word of mouth and people like yourselves coming to meetings. This is the way I learned about this. I did a lot of studying in the last year, and it is true, folks, what the Federal Reserve System did to the populace of this country should not happen to any nation or any peoples in any nation. They ultimately were going to get us down to one level, one financial status, and then they were going to impose socialism on the populace of this country. And the gears were very well enmeshed to do that with the New World Order. This brings us up to the cases that were heard throughout the last several years. There's been 15 cases of fraud taken up through the court systems, clear up through the Supreme Court, and one pertaining to fraud in the banking institutions and fraud in government. One of these cases is the J.D. Foster William Baskerville case of Fort Collins, Colorado. That case first was entered into court in the early 80s, mid-80s. Mr. Baskerville and J.D. Foster had lost their properties to Federal Land Bank. Mr. Baskerville had put over $100,000 in a special account in his bank to make 2 land payments. Federal Land Bank officials confiscated that money and then immediately foreclosed on his property. Ultimately, they took everything the Baskerville family had. This case was entered by an attorney that they hired to represent them against Federal Land Bank. The attorney lost the case, and when he lost that case, they were in a restaurant visiting Baskerville and J.D. Foster and the attorney. And the attorney told the 2 men, "I'm sorry, but you've lost everything you've ever worked for. There's nothing I can do to get it back in court." And then he left. Roy Schwasinger was sitting in the booth next to them. He overheard the conversation. When the attorney left, Mr. Schwasinger went and asked if they mind if he sit down and visit with them. And they reiterated what had transpired from the mid-80s up until that time. He wrote, Schwasinger wrote 3 lines on a napkin, and he asked them if they would take this, print it up, and take it to the court and open the case, reopen their case. And they did that. Then Mr. Schwasinger guided them through the court system, and in 1988, that case was won at the Supreme Court level concerning J.D. Foster and William Baskerville case. Since that time, it's been up and down the court system, and up and down and back, from the Supreme Court down to District Court, back up to the Supreme Court. In fact, there's still some documents being worked through the court system today. Some of them Joe Mentlick will tell you about when he comes on to speak to you. They are current happenings. But this case of the William Baskerville J.D. Foster case was declared a class action suit by a federal judge. When this happened, it opened the door for every citizen in the United States to file a claim of fraud, a claim for damages against the corporate United States government. We've operated in this country since 1913 with two governments, the corporate United States government and the government of the United States of America. And it was the corporate United States government that perpetrated the fraud and actually committed the fraud on the populace of this nation. It was that corporate United States government that wound up in court and ultimately are going to pay the damages incurred. So that brings us up to date pretty well. I'd like for Joe to come on by the federal judge ruling this a class action suit. You now can file a claim for damages against you by the government. And Joe, if you'd like to step in, I'd like for you to bring us up to date on what's happened, what's transpired in the last 2 weeks in the court system. Is he where he can reach the front?
Before we get started with Joe, could we possibly squeeze down a little bit and maybe move forward so we can get back here?
Yeah. We could come up some, I believe.
Not very much.
I don't think so. There's no room.
There's no room.
There's no more room.
Make sure you can get a tape. Joe speaks louder.
Joe speaks louder.
Everybody here.
You'll be able to hear me. My voice is a lot louder than Norman's.
Joe Mentlick.
Well, it's good to see such a nice group here tonight. About 3 weeks ago, I was in L.A. They had it at a convention center, and they told me there could be 400 or 500 people there. Well, there was around 400, and they had me wired with 2 mics, had me carrying a mic, and we was 5 minutes into the presentation when all mics went out. And they never did get it going, so I had to talk pretty loud that night. What I'm going to do is hit real fast on what has happened here just in the last few days. Did Norman talk about the minute order any?
No, he just gave history.
Okay. The Baskerville Foster case was one of the 15 cases to take precedent across the United States here. And approximately 15 months ago, they combined them 2 cases into one. And that's the one everybody's been watching down here in the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, or the 10th Circuit Court. What a lot of people don't realize, they run down there, they want to see what's going on, what's happening and stuff, and I tell everybody, if you don't have 38 inches of paperwork, then you don't have the picture, by any means. The majority of the case is sealed, so you cannot ever find anything on it. That was one of the stipulations 2 years ago. We knew it would be sealed. This minute order that I was talking about that's coming up here the 21st for a settlement conference. Claims are supposed to all be in by the 18th. Well, people, this is already history. This has been already sealed for better than 3 weeks. That's why when you call down the court now, they say it's been thrown out. I'm not saying this negative, but the court's PO'd down here.
You don't wait till
They have to have extra staffing just to answer the phone calls of people coming in, which that's all right. I don't mind that. But the settlement conference has been held. The dockets, everything is sealed. We're still in the process of bringing down the judicial system through the courts here. There's some 9 cases involved. A lot of the case numbers have never been exposed here under the Baskerville Foster name. So the only reason I'm telling you that is you're not going to be able to go down and get a handful of documents. Now, what has happened here back July 15th, I like to pick on farm credit. 1983, they got my farm back in Kansas. And I was telling my lawyer at that time that they was an entity that did not exist. And basically, he told me I was nuts. Here's a certified document straight out of the Secretary of State's office saying that the farm credit system is not registered to do business in Kansas as a foreign corporation or a Kansas corporation. When we got to checking into it, it's this way all over the United States. So we had to go find a judge that would back that decision up. We filed UCCs on the city of Fort Collins, County of Armour, several judges, lawyers, and the farm credit system. By doing that, that enabled us to go in 3 people and put them in involuntary bankruptcy. That was done July 15th by Sidney B. Brooks, U.S. Bankruptcy Court, right down here. Well,
What year?
This year.
this year,
This year.
1993, hereby finds that the involuntary petition and summons named as a debtor, an entity which does not exist. It is further found that even if the involuntary petition and summons could be found to name a proper debtor, the debtor intended is an instrumentality of the federal government. Well, every time you back them boys up in the corner, they run to the government, and then when they didn't need their umbrella, they would come out from under them. When we got this on record, we had to let it sit there and percolate for an excess of 75 days. Because then it became law. We could have appealed it. It was in our favor. We didn't want to. The United States government didn't appeal it, and now they can't change the ruling. That's why it's been taking some time, people, to bring these court systems down. But with this document here in mind, a week ago, Thursday, there was a certified question went to the Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court has to rule one, Sidney Brooks's decision, an entity which does not exist, or the state of Minnesota Supreme Court that the judge signed the order July 15th also. In this order, he stated that Federal Land Bank would have to go back and restructure everybody's loans. They could not come in and foreclose like they did. But when Sidney Brooks signed this, he's a federal judge, stating they're an entity that does not exist. We got two conflicting answers. We already know what the outcome's going to be, so we've already prepared other paperwork. Basically, what this other paperwork is, this is a copy of the document that was filed in the Supreme Court of Colorado. And I'm not going to sit here and read it all. I'm going to read the last line. All entries made into the court in the state of Colorado under the Farm Credit Services DBA Farm Credit Bank are to be stricken and property returned and damages paid thereof, and for such other further relief as may be just. Woo! Yeah. All right. Now I'm hand delivering the one for Kansas Monday, and they're going out to other states. We're hitting all 50 states. People, what this is telling us now, all national banks, all state banks, all farm credit services that fall under the instrumentality of the federal government, they could have never taken us to court in district courts like they have. They had to go to federal courts. Well, pardon the expression, but we got the judges running like hell. Now, to back all this up a little more, last Friday, we was in Judge Kerrigan's court down here. I don't think he has any love for us anymore, because since that time, I understand he is put in for early retirement. Because what happened, I described Roy this way. He's a very, very intelligent man. He's not a lawyer, but whoever he takes after, he gets this shrink wrap. You know, you've even seen these boats going down the interstate that are all sealed. Well, I don't care if it's an individual, a town, a county, or the whole damn court system. He wraps them up. And he made the comment coming down here that day. He said, if this goes right, we're going to turn the afterburners on and we're just going to go. Well, that's basically what happened, people. He put a ex-chief of police that was in office for 6.5 years on the stand and totally tore the court up. Went into the judge's oath, the lawyer's oath, the flag with the fringe around it, and asked the judge his name, rank, and serial number because we was in a tribunal court. When that happened, Judge Kerrigan got very, very, very quiet. And his eyes got about that big. Well, that wasn't enough. There was an attorney there from town here that represented PCA out of Texas, down there where they're causing Roy all this problems. And there was an attorney there from Fort Collins, Colorado, because they was thinking that they was going to get the ruling that way, that day. Fort Collins was going to be out. This attorney was going to have PCA out. But she forgot that some old dumb farmers come to town that could ask some questions. Bruce Baird, I don't know how many of them you know, because they really get mad at us, because we don't hire attorneys so they can plea bargain with them. Bruce got up, called this attorney up to the stand, asked her to state her name, address of business, phone number, her client's name, and who he represented, and she says PCA Association down there in Texas. And he said, would you further go ahead and explain what PCA stands for? This is where it really got interesting. She said that stands for Production Credit Association, a division of the Farm Credit System and the Farm Credit Bank out of Wichita, Kansas. By this time, she was wound up. She couldn't stop. And they are an instrumentality of the federal government. Well, Bruce looked at her, walked around a minute, and he said, if they're an instrumentality of the federal government that you just told me, why isn't the U.S. attorney handling this case? She didn't have nothing else to say. So Bruce sat down, said, that's all my questions. The judge asked if she wanted to cross-examine herself, because by this time there was nobody left in the courtroom on her side. Even the attorney for Fort Collins had left. She didn't. So that's what brought all this about. We've got it all in court record now, people. It's taken time. It's taken a lot of time. The banks are fighting us real bad. None of them want to get legal. They frauded the Federal Reserve. They frauded FDIC. They didn't think the government would come in and crack the whip. Here's the new banking code that they started putting together March 4th, 1993. That's the United States of America Bank. There won't be any national banks and any state bank charters. They're all going to have to fall under that charter. I think possibly after Friday, we're going to see more of them now maybe start cooperating. Because I understand there was 5 banks that went down Friday. H.R. 1214 is the... Then amongst all this paperwork we've been putting in, a lot of people don't realize it, but we do our homework. Roy does our homework. Sometimes some of these manuals sprout wings, or they become jumping beans and they jump into briefcases. But here's a manual for all banks and associations of the farm credit system. Basically what we're doing, people, is we're right now, while it's taking some more time, is we're bringing the whole system down within the court system so it'll be fixed right. And that's why it's taking a little time. But the time is just about up, and we're going to get very, very close to being able to start paying. The only other thing I'm going to say before we go into the claims, when I was in LA, 350 plus people there, Thank God the gentleman was polite. He waited till I got done talking. Then he come up, put a document in my face, and he said, "You've got a cease and desist order on you. Why are you out here spreading the word yet?" And I said, "Will you tell me one thing, sir? What's the date on it?" "July 23rd. I says, "Yes. I won't dispute that. There was one." I said, "It went to the appeals court and it's not on anymore." He says, "It is too. This is the last document we can find. I'm an investigator. And I've got a buddy up in Denver, Colorado." He says, "That's out that way about 1,000 miles. I says, "I know where it's at. My home's on the other side of it." But I said, "Give me 1 second. Here's the docket sheet on this 1281 case that everybody runs down and asks about." I pulls out, here's the cease and desist order right there. If that's the last document, how come there's all these entries? All these entries. All these entries. And all them. There's 4 pages, people. I wish we could bring all these documents up here and show you, but we can't. They've got our hands tied. Sometimes they tell me I say too much in these meetings anyway, but I like to be truthful with the people. We'll give you about 5 minutes to stand up and stretch, and then I'll go through the claims here.
Okay, hi, we're back from the break. One of the things I wanted to mention is they said that the gentleman in the gray jacket on the video said that November 30th, 1992, the national debt was eliminated. That was just prior to the change in government. That was the end of the Bush government, Bush Sr., and then of course Clinton came in a few months. We all remember there was a surplus that Clinton was bragging about during his time. That wasn't due to Clinton. That was due to what these people did and paying off the national debt and taking care of trying to turn this banking system around. That unfortunately never made it out, and it's all because of these gag orders and sealed court records, and some people have been put in are essentially political prisoners in our prison system that were working on getting this done. So there's been a lot of effort to get us turned around and back onto constitutional law and get a US Treasury bank system which is constitutionally correct, as opposed to a Federal Reserve System which is owned by people and corporations, entities, private entities. It's a private corporation, subcontracted by the US government to run our banking and monetary system. And it's definitely a for-profit organization. And if you don't know about the history of it, you should look into it. There's a lot on the internet. Would you like to see a brief clip of Roy Swassenger? He was the key military general that was leading this. SCHWASING. Now, I've looked him up on the internet, and the only thing that I can find is a disinformation website on Roy which called him a meat cutter. Now, I myself have been incredibly smeared and slandered and libeled because of my support of NESARA and because of leading an international group in support of NESARA. And so I had a big newspaper smear campaign against me in July 2004 in a city paper near my home. So, of course, all my relatives got to read this and people I'd worked with professionally and so on. And it was actually organized by the CIA, a CIA agent who lives here in Los Angeles and is the, quote, editor of a disinformation website that puts out disinformation for the FBI and CIA on certain subjects. Our government has been in the business of disinformation for a very long time. And so what they did is they found a disreputable reporter to feed information to him for 18 months. Needless to say, he didn't call me and talk to me until he had his article finalized, and he came down 2 business days. He came down on Thursday and suddenly knocked on my door and demanded at 10 o'clock in the morning an instant interview. And I said, I have a conference call scheduled and I cannot talk to you right now. If you come back in an hour, I'll talk to you. He did come back, and then at the very end of his 3 hours of grilling me, and I was very open and honest with my answers. I have nothing to hide. What I'm doing is absolutely right, and I have dedicated my life to this. I have given up social, family, personal interests to do NESARA. I do NESARA 7 days a week. And this has been my focus since June 2000. And this gentleman had been fed a lot of lies by the CIA against me, and he slanted his article that way. And when I printed out, while he was, as soon as I finished my conference call, printed out some of the confirmations and gave them to him, and then the next day went and had a meeting with he and his editor and took all the confirmations printed out, and they refused to look at even one of them. And then on the Sunday issue, they did 8 pages of smear against me in the A section of the Sunday issue, and 6 pages of smear against me and NESARA in the following Monday. This is a major city newspaper, and he thought he was really doing something. Well, all he was doing was the opposition's work to help keep you and me and all of us enslaved. This Federal Reserve banking system is owned by some of the biggest people in the world, some of the most powerful people in the world. And if you call Ron Paul's office, he had a bill out to go to a Treasury bank system a few years ago, and he will verify, or his staff will verify, it is a privately owned corporation. It is not a part of the US government. And it is for profit for those people who own it. And they purposely want to disempower you. And they've had a lot of things going on for a long time to do that. So Royce Wassinger, you cannot find him except in the Dove reports as someone who is a positive and very strong, true American who's done something good. And they have kept his name, except for this disinformation website. I haven't found it anyplace else. Now, I didn't go through every single page on the internet, but that was the one that I did come up with fairly quickly. One of the things someone said here was about national banks. Does anybody remember, some time ago in the late 80s and 90s that banks quit using the term. Some of them changed their names quite a lot, and there were a lot of mergers, and there have been a lot of mergers ongoing. Well, this is part of these people's effort to go and do these transformations in this country and get this country back on track.
Is that why they started taking off the science member of FDIC off the bank?
Yes, there was this movement had something to do with getting the FDIC off some of the banks. This is a partial action. They got some things done, but the big stuff didn't get done, did it? Because we're still living under this horrible situation. No constitutional law. It's getting worse by the day, and the Federal Reserve for-profit banking system that is bleeding you dry, and we don't even realize it, most of us, but they are. It's tremendous what they're doing to this country and to the world. So things have happened in the past. They agreed to the gag orders. They agreed to do things quietly. Well, that's not going to work. What we need is to get the NESARA law announced. And what happened was, all through the 90s, the Supreme Court was telling the military generals, oh yes, we're doing special arrangements with the Clinton administration, and we're going to get this done and we're going to get that done. But finally the generals came back in '99 and they said, you haven't gotten it done. So we want all these reforms put in a law. We want the law put in Congress, and we want Congress passing this law. And so that's what finally happened. And they put the Supreme Court judges, the same ones that put Bush into office in December 2000, were sitting on the bench when these cases came and were decided, and all through this. So what did they do? They had control, because remember, it came out of the US Supreme Court decisions on the farmers' cases. They kept control, and they put some problems into NESARA that I will talk about shortly. And so they purposely put problems in there. They had the final version of the law. They didn't show the generals what it looked like. It went into Congress, and it sat there under gag order. And it sat there. It did get some sponsors from the Senate and the House, and sat there for a year and couldn't get voted on. So finally, what the military officers did is they arranged with the heads of the House, and not the head people, but the head sponsors for NESARA of the House and the Senate, to do a written quorum call. And then Delta Force and Navy SEALs hand-delivered this written quorum call one evening in March 2000, late, after most people would be out of the Capitol building. And they were immediately brought, the sponsors and co-sponsors of NESARA, into the voting chambers, and they passed it that night. And that's how they got it done. Quorum call's legal. Doing it this way is legal. Are we ready? Okay, let's play a little bit of Mr. Swasinger, because he, and then be sure you stop it at that point. Okay, he's talking about the banks now. Are we there? Okay. So now what we're going to see is a little bit from Mr. Swasinger himself about the banking changes that he was seeing. And we saw a little bit of this happen. And of course, we weren't told, because the gag orders on the media, gag orders on Congress, gag orders on these people, gag orders on all the judges. They did it really well to keep it from coming out. They said it was because of the economic worries people would have. That's not the truth. Americans will be thrilled with a Treasury bank system. Yes, and they will be thrilled with loans where they don't have to pay 3 times over for their homes. That excuse was what they used to squash everything the good people have been doing all this time. Wait a minute for the mic, please.
Is it true that Paul Wellstone was killed because he was going to let the gag order?
No, he was killed because the Republicans wanted the balance of power in the Senate, and he was fighting Bush a lot on going to war, and so they said, well, we'll take him out because then we can put a Republican in place. That's why he was killed.
Thank you.
Paul Wellstone, the senator from Minnesota, was killed. His plane was shot down with his family just prior to the last elections. Are we there, Tammy? Okay, let's go, and here's Mr. Swasinger, a true American.
So what has happened is the government we're talking about foreign governments as well as the government in the United States got together and decided they had to do something about it. What they decided to do was create bank systems, and that's what they did. Not too long ago, there's an upheaval of currency. This is one of the creations of that. If we look at the Constitution of the United States, we have to have a metals backing our dollar. So what they're setting up is some type of a system where the dollar is going to be backed by some precious metal, gold and silver. This is what they're setting up. We know that they're doing it because we've seen mining operations starting up that are rather sophisticated, and all the gold that's owned by the United States government, and it's coming off the federal lands. So we know they're out there. We know that they're doing it because they're ordering mining equipment from South Africa. So we know it's taking place.
We know exactly what's going on out there. We know that you people are going to be rewarded in such a way.
Okay, so that's what they were talking about. And the mergers, the bank mergers, were part of this effort to get us into a US Treasury bank system. And people have been fighting behind the scenes for a very long time. Now, someone said, well, if there's a gag order, what are you doing? I'm not under the gag order. Only officials are under the gag order. People who have a position where they have been officially briefed on all of these things. And this has been going on since the middle 80s. These investigations, figuring out some ways to reform our government and our banking system. A lot of officials, all of Congress, has been under these gag orders. And the people in the banks, when they do the training, when they go to meetings with the government, they're under gag orders. I'm not. I was lucky enough to be in the network to receive this information from people who are under the gag orders but are very concerned and started to leak information out. And then because of my Dove reports, I have a worldwide network. So I have been able to get bits and pieces from all over the world and from people all over the US as to what has been going on. And that's why we can do this. We are not under the gag order. And you remember Thomas Jefferson and some of our founding fathers urged us to take action and get the government back on track when it goes off track, because unfortunately that tends to be the way things work. So I can do this, and we can do this, and there will be maybe some people who are under gag order who will have to be involved at the very last minute, because when the NESARA announcement comes out, it will be coming out from the White House, and it will be announcing that Bush and Cheney are no longer in power. That we, all of Congress, must resign, and the reason for this is because they have been breaking their constitutional oath forever. And since 1933, a great deal. It's a huge pattern of behavior that has been totally understood by some people. So they have to, that is one thing that the generals did get into NESARA. They got these resignations in there. They got the restoring constitutional law. And they got the US Treasury bank system and debt relief. Debt relief because you have been defrauded. We've all been defrauded by the Federal Reserve banking system. And so that has to, there is a consequence to that. And there will be debt relief, your bank loans and your credit cards. There's going to be forgiveness of those things, and the bank loans will be turned into self-liquidating loans, and the banks will be given processes whereby they can raise revenue to pay off the principal on your loans. And that's, they're not going to get their huge inflated interest. Compound interest is not according to what the founding fathers wanted for this country. The IRS will be gone because income tax is a direct tax, and that amendment was never ratified. Two people, the names of the people who did this research, there was a Red Beckman and a Bill Benson, right. They went to every legislature's records in the US and checked to see if they'd ratified it, and they hadn't. And this has never been able to come out. The IRS is the bully boy collector for the Federal Reserve and is a private corporation also, not really part of the US government. So there was this plan put in place a long time ago in 1913 to basically bleed the wealth and the prosperity out of Americans by these top families that own the Federal Reserve. This was not an accident. This was very much by design. So we have the right to get this law announced. And what I've done, now the first 4 years I wrote the Dove reports, I took other people's word for what was going on. Our white knights, as I call them, taking that from the Wall Street Journal idea of a white knight that rushes in and rescues a company that's vulnerable to hostile takeover, that is a term, because my background is in business, that I felt comfortable with using I couldn't say this person, this person, this person, because it would put them in danger. So I had to invent a phrase. So I've invented this phrase. They did and are, some of them still working to rescue our country from this hostile takeover that's been in place for a long time, been processed and going down its own agenda for a long time. But they can't do what I can do. I can go out and travel and talk to people openly. These people can't. And so after 4 years of accepting their word from people who were under gag order and had told us NESARA is going to be announced and here's what's going on, and then it would come and there would be nothing, and then I would get on the phone and say, what is going on? You know, this is terrible. What is happening? Of course. Finally, I said, I'm not listening to anybody anymore. I'm going to travel. I'm going to go meet with people face to face who know about NESARA for some reason and find out what is going on and what has to be done to fix it. Because I knew there had to be some problems or we would have it done, right? There had to be problems. So that's what I've been doing since July 2004, is I have been traveling. I went to one Dove report a week instead of daily reports, so I'd have the time to travel. And I found out about what the judges did to NESARA that has caused a problem. So what you have in your handout is what I discovered was that the judges had put into NESARA a 10% exchange rate. That would mean that if NESARA, as today, was, we're sharing handouts. Get one up there. We're sharing handouts because you were a lot more people coming than I realized when I was running all my printers and copiers in the living room this week. So what the judges did is they put in this provision, which the generals and other people in Congress wanted changed, but the judges said, NESARA, as we're submitting it, is a take it or leave it proposition. You don't get to change it. They did that on purpose, a 10% exchange rate, which is something that we were lied to about by the White Knights. The White Knights told us fiction stories, what they believed was true, but it wasn't true. When I actually went out and did my investigations, I found out that they didn't always tell us the truth, and sometimes they didn't know it because they were not given a copy of the law. They were given some briefings by their supervisors or their managers or their commanding officer. So what I found out was that there's a 10% exchange rate in NESARA as it currently exists because there isn't enough gold to back the new US Treasury currency enough to give a 100% exchange rate. Now, we have to get the gold, and I want to show you, and by the way, if NESARA was announced with a 10% exchange rate and you had $1,000 in your bank account the next morning after NESARA's announcement, you'd have $100, but you would still be paying today's prices until the price change can kick in, and it's going to take industry and companies some time to fix their records and be able to do that price change, probably 60 days. I called the supermarket and said, what would it take for you to change every price in your supermarket? And this is a small neighborhood supermarket. He said, gee, we'd have to put everybody on overtime. Yes, we can print out all of the prices and everything, and we can change the computer, but as far as all those prices on those shelves, he said, probably take us a month, at least. And I said, do you have the money to do that? He said, no. So there'll have to be some help there with people, because this is something that has to happen. We have inflated prices because of the Federal Reserve currency and not being backed by gold. Our prices are all inflated. So what we're going to do is we're going to get the gold for NESARA so that you don't lose a penny of your money. And when you look at this sheet, which is the statistical sheet, this came from the US Treasury website, and you can see that right where your staple is. This is all the countries that have US Treasury and Federal Reserve financial assets. And what you can see is there's a lot of our notes, bonds, currency out in the rest of the world. And it's the US currency is the reserve currency for many countries, which means they like to have some of this in their central banks. It gives them some extra stability. So if we went with NESARA as it is today, 90% of your wealth and the wealth as expressed in these numbers around the world would disappear. We would have a financial crash of tremendous proportions, far bigger than 1929. Do you understand? We need to get the gold. I learned about this a year ago, and I didn't tell you, and I haven't put these things in the Dove Report. The reason I haven't put them in the Dove Report is because in the old days when I would put in things that would upset people tremendously, I would get phone calls. So-and-so is going to commit suicide because of what you wrote in the Dove Report. So-and-so is on such a thin line. So-and-so is so depressed. So-and-so is this. So-and-so is that. I decided I would keep bad news to a minimum because we need our people to live through this, and we do have the answer. Now, a man joined the NESARA Take Action teams. He is a retired MI6 agent. He's actually not retired, but he's part-time, and part-time does humanitarian projects in the Philippines. He joined in February of 2004 and started giving me information about the Japanese war plunder in the Philippines. Finally, in about October to December of 2004, I figured out this is where we can get the gold. And that's, if you turn your page to the next one, you will see the cover of a very interesting book called Gold Warriors. There's a big lie that Truman and our government put out after World War II saying Japan had no war plunder. The reason they did that is that the OSS office, which was the predecessor to the CIA, convinced Truman to put out this lie so they could have all of that treasure to, quote, as a treasure chest to draw from to fight communism. Well, of course, that's not what really happened. What happened is a lot of people got very wealthy trying to getting some of this treasure out of the ground in the Philippines. That was a big lie, and it hurt a lot of people. There was, in the Bretton Woods Treaty, which was one of the treaty documents for the end of World War II, there were secret clauses in there about the Japanese war plunder. And it was stated that at some time, the 48 signatory nations that had been hurt by the Japanese military would be coming together, and they didn't attack 48 nations, but there were people from different nations that were in different parts of Asia, and so 48 nations were impacted indirectly. There was the clause that at some point, these nations would be pulled together, all of this war plunder would be excavated out of these very secure tunnels and sites in the Philippines, so where the Japanese military Corps of Engineers had put all of this wealth, and it would be brought into a central location and divvied out among these 48 nations to be used for humanitarian projects. This never happened, and it never happened because the CIA has been in charge of the Philippines. And secretly in charge. Yes, the Philippines managed to get the US military out of there for the most part, but they never have been able to get rid of the CIA. And what was happening in the 80s when Reagan was attempting to buy gold and getting ready for the US Treasury bank system and rainbow currency is he had a secret agreement with Marcos, President Marcos, to buy gold because Marcos was actually excavating some of these sites. Marcos had been told years before he was elected that there was this treasure there and taken when he was just an attorney and some kind of senator or something to see some of this gold. And of course he was very excited about it. When he got in to be president, he eventually made a secret agreement with the Japanese royal family that if they would send over some of their official maps of where their Japanese military buried this treasure, then he would excavate it and they would split it 50-50. Now it had to be secret because of course the Bretton Woods Treaty said 48 nations were supposed to be involved in this. What happened was that they did agree The Japanese royalties sent over some generals with some of their original, but not all, just some of their original maps when they buried this treasure, and they started in the 1930s burying treasure in the Philippines because Japan always intended to annex the Philippines and make them part of Japan. And so they were burying a lot of treasure, and if you read this book, he tells you about how they went, the Japanese country and their military went into 12 different Asian nations from the late 1800s up to the end of World War II, and systematically took the wealth out of those nations, which is out of their central banks, out of people's homes, and so on. And it was an economic movement. It's a lot like what Bush is doing to Iraq. It was an economic issue. And they had people who had gone into these countries and opened up stores and things and made friends and were taking very good notes of where all the wealth was, all the temples, everything. So when the military then came into that country, they had a system they could just follow through and grab the wealth. Well, they took a lot of it back to Japan, but some of it didn't make it that far. It got to the Philippines. And so they started burying it in the Philippines. They did very sophisticated tunnels into mountains in the Philippines and under waterfalls and all kinds of places, and put this huge amount of wealth into these treasure sites. They then booby-trapped them. They sealed them. They sealed them with 9 layers of asphalt, sand with glass bottles with poison gas in them, and bombs, booby traps, 9 layers. And then they told the villagers, you don't touch this. If you touch this, we'll come back and kill you. But if you guard this and you don't tell anybody, we'll come back and we will reward you for guarding this. Because they fully expected they would get the Philippines as part of the settlement for World War II. But when the bombs were dropped, they had no choice. They had to surrender unconditionally. So the CIA, or the predecessor of it, convinced Truman about this big lie. Marcos did manage with these maps, and what he did is he got the military generals came over from Japan to the Manila airport with some of the maps, not all of them, and they were taken in a back room, killed. The maps were taken to Marcos, and then bombs were set off in the Manila airport, and then he declared martial law 2 hours later. And then he had martial law in place, and martial law gave him the ability to tell people where they could go and where they couldn't go in the country. So he could restrict access to a lot of the country and thus send in his excavation teams to get this wealth. So he started doing this, and he got out, lots of gold. And he had to sell it at a discount because it was really illegal for him to be doing it. Then Reagan was involved in trying to get us back on a Treasury bank with gold-backed money, and so he made a deal with Marcos to buy gold. And Marcos was sending him gold memo receipts for 4 years. And Reagan gave Marcos the payment for this, and then in Federal Reserve dollars. And then Reagan finally got tired of only having no gold show up, just pieces of paper. So he said to Marcos, you have to start sending that gold over, shipping it over to the country. And Marcos just laughed at him and said, no, I'm not going to do that. So then Reagan had the CIA head man there visit Marcos, and he said, if you don't start shipping that gold immediately, in 2 weeks' time, you'll be out of here. And Marcos laughed at him. He thought that was just crazy. After all, he had a big handle on his country. Nobody was going to do that to him. 2 weeks to the day, Marcos was sending an SOS to the U.S. government to helicopter lift him out of their palace because the people's revolt was happening. CIA has tremendous control of this country, and they have never let go. Now, Marcos did manage to get a fair amount of gold out of those treasure sites, but there is over half of what the Japanese buried there still left. And those guardians, those villagers, are not telling anyone where it is. They saw that Marcos never helped them, so they're not going to help their government. Finally, and they're not telling the CIA people, and CIA has gone in and slaughtered whole villages trying to get this information. They hate the CIA, and the more I learn about it, the more I know that it has to be dismantled, and we have to start over with something new because it's too dirty, too much corruption. It's like decay at all levels. You just have to, root it out and start over. That's one thing NESARA will do. And so, interestingly, people in Philippines were starting to read the Dove reports, and this MI6 agent got in touch with me, and he said, I'm joining the NESARA Take Action teams, and there's a whole lot of gold and other things here in the Philippines you should know about. Well, when I realized suddenly last year that the White Knights had told us the wrong thing, there wasn't the gold that we needed to back the currency, then I had to find it. I had to find the gold. We're going to solve these problems and get this thing done. There's no other way to do it. So, exactly. So I did talk to him about this, and he put me in touch with some people who've been living in the Philippines for a long time, and I have a network there now, and I have been thoroughly updated on what's going on there. And as of January 1, 2005, the Bretton Woods Treaty has finally expired. What that means is that now we can buy that gold. We can buy it. It's legal for them to sell it. The Bretton Woods Treaty said wherever the war plunder was, it belonged to that country. Interestingly, the people don't tell the government where it is, because they learned from Marcos. So they have it, but they don't want their government taking this, because Marcos was a billionaire. I mean, he made himself extremely wealthy, and the people were extremely poor. And, he even put walls of gold bars inside of his palace they didn't even tell his wife about. And one time she was remodeling when he was out of the country and found this wall of gold bars. And, he used to brag about being a very wealthy person. But this was what he was doing, and it never got to serve his people. So they're very upset about that. They want to make sure that something is done for the people. There's 80% unemployment rate in the Philippines. And when I was in there, I went in December of last year, and I went in May of this year, and it breaks your heart to see what these people are living through. They're literally sitting on mountains of gold, and they can't benefit from it in any way. Now, Bush Jr., the one that we have in the Oval Office now, well, not to be outdone by anyone else, he decided he would get his hands into it. So he has made a secret contract with, and you have a copy of the report I received from my MI6 person, and it is the second page. It's called the General Preface to Enclosed Documents, attachment B1. This is from my MI6 man, and this is so sensitive, he would not send it over the internet. He sent it postal mail to me. And in here it talks about the secret agreement that Bush Jr., the president of the Philippines, Gloria M. Arroyo, GMA, and the Prime Minister of Japan, Koizumi, have signed agreeing that they will excavate all this wealth and then divide it 3 ways for themselves, not for their countries. Not for their countries. In your previous page, you have some comments about, if you read through, this is a few pages from the Gold Warriors, and it talks about that Clinton had gotten some of this gold. It's an implied thing. He was actually selling a large amount of gold or lending it after he was out of office, and about how Bush Jr. had some of our Navy ships go and pick some up in the year 2001. But of course, none of that came to our country. That's his private stash. The corruption of our people, of our officials, is incredible, and that's another reason why these wholesale resignations have to occur. On the last page of your handout, here are some pictures that my MI6 gentleman sent me, and he was actually physically taken to this gold site, this gold depository site underground in the Philippines, and he saw this bar. So he is saying in 2003 he was physically there. He has gained the trust of these people. He's a remarkable man. He does projects to help employ people as much as he can. He goes and makes money other places and then comes back and funds a project for employing people. He's really a great man. I had the privilege to have breakfast with him one day, and he came and met with me before I left again in December. And he's just a wonderful person, a real humanitarian. He's originally from Wales, by the way. And wonderful people everywhere. These people that I met in the Philippines, you know, I went in December and I spent 2 weeks with some of the guardians and keepers, they call themselves. And they have an elders network. So they're very much a village thinking culture. So their elders are the people who actually make the decisions about this wealth. And in November of 2004, when the dollar was going down, there was a meeting in Chile of the Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation Group, and there were people there from different countries, and including some in Europe, I understand. And some of those representatives were so worried about the dollar going down that they flew to the Philippines immediately after that Chile meeting, secretly, met with the elders, and proposed purchasing some of that gold, opening up 4 of the major gold sites, buying gold, and then using it to prop up the US dollar through purchases of the US dollar with this gold backing their purchases. There was not a single person from the Bush administration at this meeting, which tells you how much Bush cares about our country and our currency. Yes?
How much gold are we talking about?
I'll get there. So what we have is a situation where the gold is available for the first time to purchase. Now, November of 2004, the Bretton Woods hadn't expired, but it was going to the following January. And so they said, well, they met for 2 weeks, really seriously met to open up these 4 sites. But what stopped them ultimately was there was no way, once they opened up those sites, to protect them from the CIA swooping in and taking all of it. So that's why it didn't get done. And this is a very big issue. This is why they support NESARA, and they support having the CIA dismantled. And we are probably, the NESARA supporters, the only people who can buy this gold, because everyone else wants to steal it. And they said to me when I was over there, they said, now listen, we want the CIA gone. We really know how terrible they are. They've tortured our people, massacred whole villages, trying to get people to talk and tell them where this stuff, this treasure is, and so on. And believe me, with all their technology, they can't find those. I don't know why, but they can't. So they have not been able to spy in the sky and find these. And so they do have to go to the villagers and people who live nearby who know where they are, because generation after generation, they've passed the guardianship of these treasure sites. And they want it to be used for the benefit of humanity. And it's not going to work the way they thought in the Bretton Woods Treaty, but NESARA is to benefit the humanity, and they understand that. The ones I've met with realize getting rid of the CIA, putting this country back on constitutional law, stopping this country from attacking other countries, and stabilizing the world economy is a good thing. They realize this does benefit the whole world. And so they said to me, but if you take the CIA out of here, that leaves a big gap. And some other country will come in here and attack us. And I said, nope, it's not going to be a problem, because we will have a contract signed by the required people that we are buying this gold for NESARA, and as of NESARA's announcement, this goes into effect, and we will bring our Navy ships and our other military and protect the Philippines, because we have an investment. So we have a legal and lawful right to put protection around the Philippines until we can excavate the gold that we have contracted to buy. So they will be protected. See, there is a solution. Now, what we discovered, and I did my research, and so a lot of this, you've been reading the Dove reports, and they've all been sounding kind of banal. Well, That's because every person I have talked to and negotiated with wants anonymity and they want security. So I cannot talk about this in the Dove reports. I cannot give names of people. You have my MI6 man agreed that I could give his name out because it's a cover name anyway. So, and he's used to protecting himself, and he's in his 70s now. He's a really wonderful man. But I knew last year that I was talking to people, and I knew that we would have to have a little bit of help from our military, such as the protection of the Philippines. And last year, I talked to a gentleman named Colonel Dom Grand Prix, and he is a retired colonel, and he was talking about a military coup. And I said, we have a better way of doing this, and that's with NESARA. We don't need a military coup to get us back on track. Now, you've heard that the military was very involved with the farm claims process. They were. But a military coup is a banana republic action. It's not American. We have a law that's been passed that we just need to fix and get announced. So what I did is I put together a great deal of information, and this is one of the NESARA intelligence reports, as I call them, that I sent out to hundreds of U.S. military officers, to every office head of the FBI in the U.S., and to people in the CIA and the NSA. So you can look at this. It's just prior to attachment A is the distribution list. And I did this, and I told them that I knew that people were talking about a military coup, that they were meeting on weekends, retired and active military, retired and active intelligence leaders, meeting on weekends in 2004, talking about a military coup. And I said, you don't have to do it that way. We have a better way to do it. It's a law that's been passed. We need a little bit of help as far as getting this gold program funded, but we have a much better way to turn the country around. The constitutional line of succession would be brought up. NESARA puts great limits on the interim people. The Speaker of the House and the President pro tempore of the Senate would have the top 2 jobs, and people from the Congress who are NESARA supporters would fill the cabinet until we have new elections within a few months after NESARA's announcement. Now, the gag order on NESARA, totally different from what our white knights were telling us. That gag order has been very, very, very good at keeping people from finding out about NESARA. So there's maybe 10 to 11,000 people in our U.S. military who've been briefed on NESARA. And that was because they were going to do guard duty on the currency shipments. But the rest of them really weren't briefed on it, and it's very touchy. And most of their offices and homes are bugged. And their telephone calls are bugged, these officers. So they are very careful about what they say. So I did this and sent it out to a couple hundred military officers, and because the intelligence people were also going to these meetings for the military coup, I wanted them to know there's a better alternative than that, a hugely better alternative that does everything we need to have done. So this went out to those people, and I have received word back from some generals and the admiral in charge of the Pacific Command that they do support NESARA and they will do what they need to do to help us when the time comes. They're very careful because they can't expose themselves right now, which is why I'm going out and doing the coordinating of what needs to be done. So this you can look at later, and I called it Restoring America Through Improving and Announcing NESARA. And it has a lot of attachments. I put in some on the Gold Warriors, and then some my MI6's man's information. Again, I'm breaking the gag order on NESARA on purpose to these people. I can do that. A one-way transformation or sending of communication is totally okay. And very few of them have asked to get off my mailing list. Very few, a handful. Which means that there are people who are sitting there, because this is really a bombshell. I mean, this is really turning our country around and turning our banking system around. It's a big deal, and they know it. These guys are pretty savvy when it comes to politics. Yes?
Are copies of that available right now?
No. This costs me a tremendous amount of time and energy to put these together. And I have to copy everything myself because there's confidential, top secret information in here. And I actually did have to go to Kinko's to get a special photocopy of something that I had to reduce. And it had something like $100 million. It was a certificate. It's one of the certificates in the section of this section here, which is P. And it was one of these certificates with a huge amount of money on it because this is some of what is buried there. And part of it's war plunder and so on. And I think it was this one. And my God, you know, the man who was watching the Kinko's lady help me saw that figure on there and he said, "Is that real? My God, what is that?" And I quickly said, "It's not in the country. It's not in the country." I was trying to get him not to see it because if Kinko's or anybody, any other service had copied this, they would be calling the US Treasury Department. "What's going on? We think there's somebody doing something wrong here." It's absolutely not wrong for me to have this, but it would cause some unnecessary stir that we don't need. So these are a need-to-know thing. If someone can help NESARA, I will give them a copy. And I'm down to my last 3. I've got to make some more copies if I have a lot of people to talk to. Yes?
The document that Congress was forced to sign in March of 2000, does anyone have a copy of that?
No, of course not. It's under gag order. The same as the court records. Those are sealed. Everything, and they weren't forced to sign it. These were sponsors and co-sponsors of NESARA who were taken in on a quorum call, and they voted for and passed NESARA. A quorum call is a process our U.S. Congress allows in order to get business done. Sometimes people are on vacations, they're distributed around doing election campaigning, and they still need to get something done in Congress. And so it is an absolutely lawful process to be able to get some legislation passed. They did that in 1913 on December 23rd, when there had been years of fighting against a central bank, and especially a private central bank. And they couldn't get Congress to agree to pass it. So what they did is after they had their Jekyll Island meeting and they put this whole thing together, then they planned that only the supporters of the Federal Reserve would stay in Washington up to Christmas, and then they would do a secret quorum call and bring those people in. And that's how, late at night on December 23rd, in 1913, they passed the Federal Reserve Act. So we used their tactic, which is lawful, to fix things. Well, those people were very happy to vote for this. They weren't forced at all. They just didn't know, there had to be a process by which they could get in there and vote and get it passed. Now, the judges have sat on the announcement, but we don't have to let them sit on it. We can fix NESARA and get it announced without their involvement at all, because they've committed treason more than one time. And in December 2000, when they put Bush into office, they committed treason. And I have the investigative report that I have included in here for those Army and our U.S. military officers and our intelligence people, because they probably didn't see it. But it was done, and it was published in Vanity Fair, because that's a place where some things are coming out that you wouldn't believe. In October of 2004, an investigative reporter had interviewed the law clerks of the U.S. Supreme Court. In December of 2000, these law clerks were in place, and Sandra Day O'Connor said, "I'm going to do whatever I have to do to get Bush into the White House. I'm just looking for some kind of foundation, some kind of excuse, some kind of premise in law that I can use to get him in there." And the other Republican judges said the same thing, and they were floating around secret memos to each other about what kind of basis can we use to do this. That was not constitutional. They had no right to do that. So I wanted the military and the others to know we have the right to do this, because the people sitting on this are acting in treason. They are traitors to this country, and we don't have to sit around and take this kind of treatment. We, the people, can get things done and get this organized. Now, the gentleman back there asked about the cost. And it is, I will show, in case you want to look at this, and I know we're going to run out of time pretty quick here. In February of 2005, I went onto the internet and I found the closing cost of gold in London. Oh, I've got it in my copy. Got it marked. It's a little easier than finding one that isn't marked. And this is what I lifted off of the internet. It's official gold pricing. And I had to learn all about how they price gold and troy ounces and all of that. But what it came out to was that we want to buy, and they do have available, 1 million metric tons of gold. Yes. They actually have still about 1.5 million metric tons of gold. There is so much more gold in the world than our banking system and governments have ever let us know. It's not even funny. Another big lie. And so that will cost us around between 13.6 and 15 trillion based on where the gold price is at the time we negotiate the contract. Now, some of you were reading the Dove reports before I started writing about NESARA, and I was writing about something called Omega, a prosperity program. And that's another big secret that our bankers and our governments keep from us. There are trading programs in the European banks. They're not allowed to be run in US banks because of the 1933 Glass-Steagall Act. But they are run in European banks where if you come in with hundreds of millions of dollars or a billion or more, you can make phenomenal returns. Phenomenal. So I have known about this for a long time, and I've had my intelligence people confirm this is real. And what better way to get NESARA funded than to use the European bankers' own trading program to make the money to get the gold for NESARA. Essentially, the European banks, let's say that Barclays Bank wants $100 billion to raise $100 billion for doing loans to its major clients, okay? Corporate loans, personal loans, whatever. The way that they raise some of that money is that they will issue a midterm note with a face value of $100 billion. And it goes into a closed environment where only 8 big traders who've been specially licensed to do these transactions, 8 big trading organizations can work with Barclays and with finding clients to purchase this. And so they are the traders who coordinate things. So they have $100 billion MTN, they call them, and only the top 25 banks in the world are allowed to do this. So these banks, this is how they raise their capital for doing loans. So what happens is that the trader has people brought to him by invitation. These things are not something you can find in an advertisement. It's illegal to advertise. It's illegal for the trading organizations to solicit. This is all very much an old boys club thing. It's really wealthy, making people, making more of their good friends wealthy. And it's controlled, interestingly enough, by the Federal Reserve System. What they do, the majority of the controlling. The Federal Reserve sets up these trading programs. They set up how they operate and what they are different lengths and so on. The best one is a 1-year trading program. And the minimum they will accept, our trader will accept, and we talked to him on May 9, 2005, is $300 million US. They prefer that the minimum investment be $1 billion because the traders and the bankers all get a little bit off of each transaction. Now what happens is that the investor, we can take an investor into this very exclusive, hard to get into trading transactions world. We can introduce him to the trader. That's our gift from our side. We want to be a joint venture with an investor so that NESARA gets half the proceeds and the investor gets half the proceeds. Now we have the connection to the trader, and lots of people with money don't have that. We also have NESARA, if they would like to see the world turned around, get the U.S. military out of Afghanistan and Iraq quickly, get our country back on track, get our economy in the world better, and so on. We have the answer here. So we do have that, but as a strictly business proposition, there are a lot of wealthy people who have never been able to get into these trades because they didn't know the right person. And anyone who goes in there has to sign a 5-year non-disclosure that they absolutely will not speak a word about them. So there's a real heavy pressure, and people don't talk about it. But we have this capability to take someone with 300 million, 500 million, a billion, whatever, cash in an account. Most people don't keep that much cash in an account, but they can liquidate stocks and bonds because the return on this is phenomenal. It's 100% a week on a 1-year contract, and I am not kidding. Say again? No risk involved, because at the top with the big 8, everything is done contractually. So the investor gets a contract with the big 8's trader organization, and everything is kept very specific and systematic, and nobody gets cheated in this, because the big 8 are not going to allow something like that to happen. That does happen in the lower trades. They don't deal with those. They deal with only the big ones. And it's a banker, the trader organization is a banker organization, and the investor has his money in a major bank, and there's banker to banker exchange of codes and security information so that they know they're talking to the right person, and the trader makes sure all of this has been checked out, and he makes 2 phone calls and finds out that that investor is clear, doesn't have any felonies, doesn't have any bank fraud background, and he can find that out very quickly, and this can go forward very fast. There's a tremendous amount of security. Our trader makes sure that the investor is the person who comes in, that no one ends up substituting themselves. So there's an initial piece of information we give our trader as to the investor's name or the entity name, and then when his organization goes back to the banker of the investor, they make sure that the contracts that come back to the trader are for that person, and the banker hasn't substituted himself. They're very careful. Our trader also lets the investor sit side by side with the trader while he does the transactions. So they can see this happening, and they can check their bank account, and they'll see these profits going into their bank account throughout the week. Now, this makes a lot of money very quickly, and we need a lot of money very quickly. What we need is to get a trading program going so that we can go to the Philippines and negotiate this contract and be able to point to some revenues that we can't talk about as coming from the trading program. But we can put some into an account for NESARA, and I have an international business corporation set up for NESARA, and someday I'll tell you the name of it, and you'll love it. But anyway, it's appropriate. It's about liberty. And that will be there, and we will be able to say to the people in the Philippines, we're serious buyers. Here's our banker's number. You can call him and verify we have so much on deposit. And we can tell you that this is continuing to grow. And in the contract, of course, we will make some kind of an agreement with them about payment processes and probably some down payment amount after NESARA is announced. And so it will be upon NESARA's announcement, this contract will go into effect, and we will then have specified deposits of gold that we own in the Philippines. Now, interestingly enough, this is totally legal, totally lawful. Because in World War II, central banks shipped their gold out of their country into other places to keep Hitler from getting it. So we have total legality here in not having physical control of our gold. This is an accepted procedure in the world among the big banks and central banks. And on top of that, the big banks and central banks recognize that there are these gold deposits. They won't tell you about it. That's part of the big lie. But they already recognize, and there is recognition and have been some certificates against the gold that is sitting underground in the Philippines. at times in certain banks. And I talked to someone who had actually worked in Barclays in London and saw some of these. And I talked with another gentleman recently who's also seen them. So this is very, in these closed circles, very well known. So we can negotiate this, specify the gold deposits we are buying for NESARA, and once we have this contract signed, while we're negotiating, and I'm guessing it'll take us a few weeks to do that because people like to talk when you get into negotiations. Once we get that signed, we can go forward with the announcement. That is the big piece. That's what we have to do. We need the trading program so we can prove we are serious buyers and that we have some money in an account. We can have them verify it all openly, but of course we can't tell them that it's coming from trading because of the non-disclosure. But that's the plan, and it can happen very quickly. What I'm looking for is some good people who have funds or people who have contacts to wealthy people who either want to make this as strictly a business thing, and we can talk to them about it as a joint venture, strictly business, not bring up NESARA, but it's a real coup to get into one of these big 8 traders. And they can do up to 4 trading programs. That's the rule. And then they will be put on a list where they can't do anymore. And so the traders are always looking for new investors because they don't allow people to just forever and a day monopolize that. So they need new people coming in. So we have this opportunity. And one of the reasons that we're here is there may be some people in show business or entertainers. Some of you may know somebody who knows somebody, and particularly the people who are against the war, who might be able to help us reach or put some money together themselves to do a trading program. One of the people I think we would love to talk with would be Oprah, but she's not here, but I mean, she lives here part-time. And there are others who definitely would like to see some improvements. Oprah's very low-key about what she says, but she's there. She's there. So we would, this is what we need to do for NESARA. We need to get the trading program going. Now we have other people working on this. I've been talking to people, but so far we don't have it signed. And so until that happens, we don't have it, and I have to keep going. They will make an enormous amount of money. So it grows very, very fast. So we'll have plenty of money to pay for the gold. They can't get it out of the ground as fast as we would have the money to pay for it. Because it's going, 9 layers of asphalt, bombs, gas, etc. It's going to take a while to excavate. So we have the plan. We know what needs to be done. We have some backing from our really good people around the world. And we need your help getting to people who have that kind of investment. So it's everything is contractual. The investor will know when he signs the contract what he's getting. He'll know he has a 5-year non-disclosure and so on. So this is very doable. Now, what I'm passing out now is information I have researched because we are in big trouble in this country. And I want you to, this is not happy news, but we need to face reality. If you don't face reality, you can't fix things. So you have to know what it is we're facing. And we have Homeland Security. If you translate that, that's in German, that was the same name as they called the Gestapo. Okay, we have, the Patriot Act gave Bush Jr. as many powers as Hitler had. He just hasn't been able to get them worked. He wants to do another big terrorist attack, and if you don't know that the Bush government did 9/11, then you really should get a couple of videos confronting the evidence and 9/11 in plain sight, PLANESITE. Those will show you right away that he did it. And of course, I knew it right afterwards because my network was reporting to me. A woman who worked at the Pentagon was told on September 10, don't come to work tomorrow. Her office was right where it blew up. And she then saw, and her boss said, don't come to work tomorrow, and whatever you do, don't go to the World Trade Center in New York. She didn't, and the next day she saw why. Yes?
I know this gentleman. I'm not going to give
Closer,
his name.
closer.
Oh, I'm nervous now. And so I knew he was in construction and he was working back in New York and Washington.
And I asked him what he did, and he said, well, he's cleaning up and rebuilding.
The World Trade Center?
Yeah, but he was at the Pentagon the day that happened, and he says, but I can't say anything, so I just asked him a couple of questions, and he said yes to everything. Yes, they did make him sign paperwork. They took all their cameras, and that these guys ran right out. And he was there that day.
Yeah. Well, people were told not to come to work in the World Trade Center. They were told not to come to work in the Pentagon. Unfortunately, some people weren't told that, but a lot were, and that's because our government did this. And Stanley Hilton, who's an attorney in San Francisco, is doing a civil lawsuit against the Bush government for 400 families of the 9/11 survivors who are saying the Bush government did it. We know that Patrick Fitzgerald is our federal prosecutor in Chicago, and he has taken testimony that from all kinds of people proving that the Bush government did 9/11. That came out of his Valerie Plame CIA outing investigation, and he's gone way back, and he now has testimony against Bush Sr., Clinton, and a lot of other people, and the U.S. Supreme Court judges for what they did in December 2000. So there's a man that we want to put in place after NESARA gets announced. Now, what I need from you is some help on finding people with funds. And they can be just straight business, a huge return. You know, $2,000 a year when we're doing a joint venture, you can't find that anyplace else. And then they can still work with our trader on other trades if they want to, but we need this for NESARA. And so that's an investment opportunity. If they care about the country, then they can also support NESARA this way. And we're going to, as soon as we can get this trade going, we will send letters of invitation to the people in the Philippines that have to come to the meetings for the contract negotiations, and to the admiral in charge of Pacific Command, who will send some of his people to the meetings, because we have to, as part of the negotiation, our military is going to protect the Philippines for a couple of years, so we have to have a ballpark figure in the contract for compensation, because obviously that's expensive. So we're ready to go. We just have to get these going. Now, once an investor agrees to work with us and can liquidate or have 300 or 500 or $1 billion or whatever in a bank account, then we can give a tear sheet to our leader, to our trader, who is actually the person that then moves the whole process forward. And we can do a joint venture agreement with the investor, and a trade can get going in somewhere around 10 days, 10 business days. We can have a trade going. And it is possible to get this done, to get NESARA done this year, but it's a push. It's a push. So we need your help. And think about people you know, and please, please don't let the thought, oh, if I ask someone, they're going to get mad at me and never talk to me again. You know what? We don't have time for that right now, because these camps are waiting. There's 600 death camps in the U.S. There's 107,000 railroad cars that were built in Portland, Oregon by Gunderson Steel Fabrications that have 143 sets of manacles in them. You do the math, 15 million Americans can be taken to the death camps at one time with just those railroad cars. This all came out of the 80s and has been sitting there, and most of these camps were put up in the 90s. But the Rex 84 was, oh, we have too many people coming over the borders and they have to be put someplace and then taken home. No, that's not it. This is Americans. We still have UN troops here. We have enough UN troops that they could implement this. Our National Guard are being trained to go up to Americans' doors and take them prisoner and take them to the camps, and I have that from people directly that I know and have talked to in the last year on the phone. So we have a very serious situation. We need to get this trading program going as soon as possible. Bush wants to get another big terrorist attack in the next 6 to 8 months and then declare martial law. If he can do that, we are Nazi Germany, but we are 1,000,000 times worse, and it destroys the world. I have talked to other people around the world about this, and I said, if the U.S. goes down, you go down, because they have those camps too. And every one of them knows that, and they know we're the only ones who can turn this world situation around. Yes?
What happened to the Omega trading program?
Omega is held by Bush Sr., Rockefeller, and the Bergevin is held by Bush Sr. and Orrin Hatch and other horrible, corrupt people, and they will never fund it. And part of my plan that I have in here is to rescue those two programs and possibly some others. We cannot, trustees decide funding. And when I asked for people to get lawsuits against the Omega trustees and Bergevin trustees a few weeks ago, I got a response. There are 2 legal actions against the Omega trustees and 1 against Bergevin. We want them to delay it because we can rescue those programs with NESARA. Once NESARA is announced, we can take them away from those trustees, and I'm not going to tell you how I'm doing it.
Would it be possible for a person that has bullion to enter this? Not
No,
cash?
it has to be cash.
Oh.
Now, if someone has gold and they can get it turned into cash through various processes, that can sometimes work. But it would be a little tricky.
Have you heard about what's going on in New York this weekend?
No.
I asked Dove if she knew what was going on in New York this weekend. They've issued terrorist threats, and they're basically closing down the city to search for strollers and backpacks. And it's a martial law scene there right now.
Yeah, it is. And also, you know, the attacks in London were done by the MI5 planned them, and their military carried them out, and some people have got the investigation and proof on that. And interestingly, the second attack was the day they pushed through the permanent clauses of the so-called Patriot Acts. And they did that so that, because they couldn't get them happening here, but that was close enough, and they put enough pressure on Congress to get those passed. That will all be abolished with NESARA, totally abolished.
Dove, I want to ask you a question about this so-called avian flu. John Rappaport, who's an investigative reporter, was talking about this being kind of a total scam to scare everyone and to give Bush the license to go ahead and quarantine certain regions of the country. And he asked the military or Congress permission to do this so he can institute these vaccinations. And is this another attempt for martial law?
It's another scam, yes. They're using everything they can possibly use. And we do have some help in our military and higher levels of intelligence stopping some of these things. Go ahead.
I'm wondering, once this goes down, isn't the way to handle treasonous people to put them in jail or hang them?
Sure, yes.
I keep hearing that they're going to just go away. Well,
No.
where's justice?
No, that's not true. What will happen, and this is why Mr. Fitzgerald is doing what he's doing. He has the goods on a whole bunch of our politicians, on the judges, and those indictments will come out, and these people will be charged. And I don't think you'll see it before NESARA's announcement.
Dub, I think you had mentioned earlier that when NESARA is announced that the prices of everything is going to be take 90% out of everything. Just like if a house costs $1 million, that it probably costs after NESARA about $100,000, correct?
That's because we have to have enough gold to back the values of things in our country. And Federal Reserve, useless money, nothing behind it, has inflated prices. So we have to fix that by bringing them back into line with an arbitrary 90% decrease. No one's going to lose anything because it's across the board. Now, this is going to push this around the world, and also us getting rid of income tax is going to push that around the world, because if we don't have income tax, those other countries will have to get rid of it, or they'll lose all their good companies and individuals to the U.S. So we're going to do things for the rest of the world with what we're doing with NESARA.
I was just wondering, the Supreme Court, is that going to be affected by the enactment of NESARA?
Yes. And there's going to be some other things, some really wonderful surprises that I can't tell you about. But none of them will be judges anymore. And, you know, now I'm going to close. Anybody who knows influential people, entertainers, knows somebody who knows them, if you can take the time to come and visit with us in the restaurant, I really need your help on this. And remember, if you think you're going to offend somebody, no, they're going to make a huge return. We have ways to show them about NESARA. This is, you know, part of what we're doing to educate people. And it will help the world. And please, don't put your worries about, oh my gosh, if I talk to so-and-so, then they're going to hate me or think I'm an idiot, and then I'll never talk to them again. Maybe what you'll get is a positive response and get this done. And it's worth it because it saves your life, and it saves the life of your friends, and it saves the world, because if Bush could get this, they would start doing this worldwide. We've got to stop it here. All right? Let's do it. Thank you. Okay.